A sharp knock cut through the silence of a winter night in New York. Maxwell Reid, billionaire investor and master of every detail in his life, wasn't expecting anyone. But when he opened the heavy brass door of his townhouse, he froze. A little girl stood there barefoot, her thin legs trembling against the ice. Her lips were blue, her cheeks blotched from the cold, and her tiny fingers gripped a crumpled paper bag as if it were the last thing holding her to the earth. She lifted her face to him, wide eyes glistening, and whispered, "Do you have any bread?" Then, almost too quietly to hear, she added one word that shattered his composure. Dad. For a man who had built an empire on control, it was the one word he couldn't control. Maxwell's first thought was disbelief. He had no daughter, or at least none he knew of. Yet there was something in her voice, something that reached past reason and drove straight into the part of him he thought had gone cold long ago. Tell me, if a child looked up at you and called you, "Dad, would you close the door or let her in?" Leave your answer in the comments because this story is about to take a turn that no one could see coming. The girl swayed on her feet. Maxwell instinctively reached out, steadying her small shoulders. Her skin was icy even through the fabric of her oversized hoodie. "Come inside," he said quickly, though his voice cracked. The words surprised him. He hadn't invited anyone into his private world in years, not without layers of security, but now his instincts overruled his habits. Inside, warmth radiated from the fireplace, and the sudden contrast made her shivering worse. She sank into a chair, still holding the paper bag, as though it carried the only piece of her identity left. Elena, the housekeeper, appeared with a startled gasp. Without hesitation, she hurried to the kitchen and warmed a slice of sourdough. When the bread was placed before her, the girl tore it into tiny pieces, counting each bite under her breath before slowly eating. The ritual was haunting. It spoke of hunger so deep that even food had to be rationed like treasure. Maxwell crouched beside her. "What's your name?" he asked softly. For a long moment he thought she might not answer. Finally her voice came thin and fragile. "Ava. Minnie Hook Ava." A name as delicate as the child herself, spoken like a secret, carried through the snow. Doorman. Frank stepped inside, a hat in his hands. "Mr. Reid," he said carefully. "She's been seen on this block before, asking for food. Folks say she never lingered anywhere long. But tonight she came straight here. She knew your door." He gave a heavy pause. "Almost like she was looking for you?" Maxwell's stomach tightened. How could a stranger's child know where he lived, let alone call him father? Was this a scam or something much more complicated? Elena, while folding the girl's wet hoodie by the fire, found a slip of paper in the pocket. A bakery receipt from Ferrara in Little Italy, the date circled in red ink. Maxwell turned it over in his hands. What kind of 6-year-old carried a bakery receipt? He looked at Ava, but her tired eyes never left the flames. He had spent his life in rooms where every decision was calculated, every move rehearsed. But this was chaos. And yet strangely he couldn't walk away from it. Minnie Hook. My mom said Ava whispered suddenly, "If I ever got lost, find you." The words hit like a verdict. Somewhere in this city a woman had told this fragile girl that Maxwell Reid was her only refuge. Whether it was truth or lie, accident or fate, didn't matter in that moment. All that mattered was that a child stood in front of him, freezing, desperate, and clutching to him as if he were the last person in the world who could keep her alive. He pulled out his phone, dialing Mount Sinai Hospital. "I need a pediatric consult immediately," he said, his voice clipped, rehearsed from years of negotiations. But as he spoke, he felt a tug at his sleeve. Ava's small voice barely rose above the hum of the fire. "Daddy, don't leave." Maxwell froze. He had heard those same words in different tones across boardroom tables, whispered in desperate phone calls from people facing foreclosure. But never had they carried this kind of weight. Never had they cut so directly into his chest. Minnie Hook? For the first time in decades, the man who never bent to pressure realized he could not walk away. Helena draped a blanket around Ava's shoulders. The girl leaned into it, but kept her eyes on Maxwell, waiting as if every breath she took depended on what he would do next. He felt something shift inside him, an unsteady crack in the armor he had built over a lifetime. This wasn't a contract he could renegotiate, nor a problem he could delegate. This was a child, flesh and blood, calling him father. And as the wind howled outside, Maxwell Reid, billionaire protector of nothing but his own empire, made the choice that would change his life forever. Now I'll ask you again, what would you do if this child showed up at your door? Would you believe her? Would you take her in? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because Ava's story and Maxwell's has only just begun. The ambulance bay at Mount Sinai Hospital glowed under harsh fluorescent lights as Maxwell carried Ava in his arms, wrapped in a wool blanket that seemed far too thin to fight off the January cold. Her head rested against his chest, breaths shallow and uneven. For years he had lived in a world where emergencies meant falling stock prices or hostile mergers. This was the first time he had felt the pulse of real urgency, the kind that had nothing to do with money. Nurses rushed to meet him as the sliding doors opened, their eyes darting from his expensive overcoat to the fragile child he clutched as if she were the only thing tethering him to the earth. 6 years old, exposure, mild hypothermia, one of them announced, slipping a thermometer under her arm. Maxwell set her down on the gurney with hands that trembled more than he wanted to admit. Ava stirred faintly, reaching for him even as they wheeled her toward a curtained bay. He followed close, unwilling to let her vanish behind the partition. The attending physician, a woman with calm eyes and quick movements, explained that Ava was stable for now, but dangerously cold, her body unable to hold heat on its own. They began warming her gradually, wrapping her in heated blankets, placing an IV line for fluids. Maxwell stood at the edge of the room, a silent sentinel in a tailored coat, watching each monitor beep as if it might decide her fate. He had closed billion-dollar deals without blinking, but here every flicker of her pulse line on the screen threatened to undo him. Minnie Hook. Then came the social worker. Camila Ortiz stepped in, clipboard in hand, her tone firm but not unkind. She was the type of professional who had seen every version of desperation every child caught in the cracks of the city. "Mr. Reid," she began, "can you tell me your relationship to the child?" The question carried more weight than any contract clause he had ever signed. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. Father's stranger, rescuer. He settled on the safest truth he could manage. "She showed up at my door tonight, alone. She called me Dad." Camila's brow furrowed. "Do you have any legal proof of parentage?" He shook his head. "Then, here's the situation," she continued. "We can place her in emergency custody with the state until family is located. Or, if you're willing, she can remain in temporary, kin-like placement with you for 48 hours while we investigate." 48 hours. The number echoed in Maxwell's mind like a countdown clock. He glanced at Ava, tiny under the warmed blankets, and felt something twist inside. The idea of her vanishing into the system, another faceless child shuttled between strangers, was unbearable. "I'll take her," he said firmly. "I'll take responsibility until you find someone else." Camila's eyes searched his measuring intent against image. "If she is your biological child, we'll need proof. I recommend a rapid DNA test. Results in 24 to 48 hours. She paused. "Until then, remember you're a temporary guardian, not a permanent one." Maxwell nodded, but inside the word temporary felt hollow. Ava stirred, murmuring something incoherent, and he bent close, catching only the faintest syllables. It didn't matter what she said. What mattered was that she wanted him near. Minnie Hook. The first clue surfaced not from Maxwell but from Ava's own pocket. When Elena had folded her hoodie earlier, she had slipped the crumpled bakery receipt into Maxwell's coat. Now, under the harsh hospital light, he smoothed it flat. Ferrara Bakery, Little Italy. The date circled. A handwritten scrawl on the back, just 3 numbers of a phone that no longer worked when he tried it. But it was something. Proof that Ava and her mother had left breadcrumbs, however faint. He carried the slip to Camilla. She had this, he explained. Camilla examined it, nodding slowly. Ferrara runs a soup kitchen line every Wednesday. Volunteers sometimes leave messages for families on the back of receipts. Could be the trail to her mother. Maxwell felt a rush of conflicted relief. A mother meant answers, but a mother also meant questions he wasn't ready to face. Hours passed. Ava's color improved, though her body remained fragile, trembling at every shift of the blanket. Maxwell sat by her bed, reading aloud from a tattered copy of The Velveteen Rabbit one of the nurses provided. His voice faltered when he reached the line about becoming real through love, and for the first time in years he swallowed against a lump in his throat. Ava's eyelids fluttered, but she didn't sleep. Instead, she reached weakly for the bread roll the nurse had placed on the tray. She broke it carefully, piece by piece, and placed half into his palm as if to seal an unspoken pact. Minnie Hook. Even in the hospital bed, she was teaching him something about survival. Camilla returned the next morning with updates. No relative had come forward yet. No missing child report had been filed. We'll continue the search, she assured. But the fact that no one reported her missing, it's troubling. Maxwell pressed for answers. What about shelters, foster care, the waiting list for placements? Camilla explained the process in a matter-of-fact way. The same explanation she had likely given hundreds of times. Emergency placement background checks, home inspections, all designed to protect the child, but none of it fast. Maxwell listened, but what stayed with him wasn't the bureaucracy. It was Ava's soft whisper when she woke again that afternoon. She didn't ask for toys or clothes or comfort. She asked the same thing she had asked on his doorstep. Do you have bread? The question burned him more deeply than any accusation. Here was a child who measured safety not in promises but in food she could hold count ration. Bread was her lifeline, her shield, and somehow she had chosen his door to knock on. By evening, Maxwell had arranged the rapid DNA test. A technician arrived discreetly swabbing Ava's cheek as she looked at him with quiet confusion. "Is this so I can stay?" she asked, her voice hoarse but steady. He squeezed her hand, unable to answer directly. "It's so. We'll know," he said. Inside, he wondered whether he was ready for the truth. As he watched her drift to sleep again, her hand still curled around a half-eaten roll, Maxwell understood the depth of what had begun. The countdown had started. 48 hours to prove whether he was a stranger or a father. 48 hours to decide what kind of man he would be when the answer came. The following morning, Maxwell sat at the head of a glass table in the top floor of Reid Capital, staring at numbers that no longer felt like numbers. The boardroom was as familiar as his own skin-polished mahogany leather chairs, a skyline view stretching across Manhattan. He had spent years dominating this room, but today it felt like a place he barely recognized. His phone buzzed on the table with another alert. Tabloids were already running a photo of him carrying a barefoot child into Mount Sinai. The headline was cruel in its simplicity. Billionaire with a street child. Investors were nervous. Board members circled like sharks. His chief of public relations leaned forward, her voice sharp. "Maxwell, you need to distance yourself from the girl until the DNA results are clear. Right now, all anyone sees is a scandal." Her words were calculated, designed to protect the company. But Maxwell thought of Ava's tiny hand pressing bread into his palm the night before, and the suggestion tasted bitter. He didn't respond, only flipped open a ledger the CFO had laid before him. That ledger was supposed to be routine accounts, closed loans collected. But one line made his eyes freeze. It was a foreclosure on a bodega in Washington Heights 2 years ago. The name on the file was Rosa Alvarez. Maxwell read it twice. Rosa, the same name Ava had whispered when a nurse had asked about her mother. His chest tightened. He turned the page slowly, as if more time might change the words written there. The file was clear. Rosa had fallen behind after a loan repayment error. An insurance claim had been denied for missing paperwork. Reid Capital had executed the clause without mercy. The result, the store was seized, the apartment above it lost. Maxwell sat back in his chair, the weight of the page pressing into his hands like a sentence. He remembered signing that authorization himself. To him, it had been another case in a stack of hundreds. But to Rosa, it had been the collapse of her home. To Ava, it was the beginning of nights spent begging for bread. For years he had prided himself on discipline, on never letting emotion cloud his judgment. But now, looking at those lines in the ledger, he felt something close to shame. His empire had not just failed strangers, it had failed a child who might be his own. Minnie Hook. He drafted a new policy right there in front of the board. From this day forward, he said evenly, though his throat was dry, Reid Capital will establish a relief and remission program. Cases of hardship will be reviewed, repayment terms adjusted, forgiveness granted where necessary. We will fund a community bread fund with the same bonuses we pay ourselves. The board erupted. One director slammed a hand on the table. "You'll destroy shareholder confidence," another snapped. "You're admitting guilt." The PR chief hissed that such a statement would be financial suicide. But Maxwell didn't flinch. For the first time in years, he spoke not as a financier, but as a man who had seen the human cost of his signature. Still, he knew words weren't enough. He needed proof. He left the boardroom before they could vote him down, carrying the bakery receipt Ava had clutched in her hoodie. By afternoon, he was standing in Ferrara Bakery in Little Italy. The owner, a weathered man with flour still dusting his sleeves, remembered Rosa. She had come often, sometimes bartering small favors for day-old loaves. She didn't just take for herself, the man recalled. She shared what she got with other mothers at the food pantry down the block. That detail hit Maxwell harder than anything else. Rosa, even in her need, had given, and he, with all his resources, had taken. He left the bakery with a fresh loaf under his arm, not for himself, but for Ava. That night, he carried her with him to the pantry in Brooklyn. The room smelled of soup and fresh rolls. Children clustered around folding tables. Ava's eyes widened at the sight, a cautious light breaking through her weariness. When another child offered her a cookie, she smiled a real smile, the first he had seen. Maxwell felt something in his chest ease, as if a door long sealed had opened a crack. Minnie Hook. At 2 a.m, he loaded a truck himself. He had ordered loaves from bakeries across the city, boxes stacked in the back. With Ava beside him on the passenger seat, still wrapped in a blanket, they drove along FDR Drive, stopping at shelters one by one. She counted each bag aloud as they handed them out, her voice soft but steady. It turned her old ritual of rationing into something new, giving. Maxwell watched her, realizing she was teaching him how survival could become generosity. By dawn, they returned to his townhouse. Ava was asleep before he carried her inside, a crust of bread still clutched in her hand. He laid her gently in the guest bed and stood watching for a long moment. She was only a child, yet she had reshaped the way he saw everything: money, power, responsibility. The next morning, his phone buzzed again. It was the DNA lab. The results would be ready by tomorrow. A final confirmation of whether Ava was truly his daughter. Maxwell set the phone down, staring out at the skyline. The board was threatening to remove him if he continued down this path. Investors wanted stability, not redemption. But for the first time in his career, he wasn't thinking about their approval. He looked at the sleeping child upstairs, the ledger still open on his desk, and the bakery receipt folded in his pocket. Whatever the DNA revealed, he knew one truth already. He had failed Rosa, and by extension, Ava. And no matter what the board decided, he would not fail her again. The morning air outside the courthouse carried a chill sharper than the calendar promised. News vans lined the street, their cameras angled toward the steps where Maxwell Reid arrived, with Ava's small hand wrapped around his finger. He had faced plenty of public scrutiny in his career, but never with a child beside him, never with a question this personal hanging over his head. Inside his coat pocket was an envelope from the DNA lab, sealed, its weight somehow heavier than all the ledgers he had ever signed. They didn't wait long. In the family court chamber, Judge Daniels presided with the steady presence of someone who had seen families splintered and stitched back together countless times. Maxwell rose when called Ava, sitting quietly in the front row with Camilla Ortiz nearby. His lawyer whispered that the results could be presented at any time, but Maxwell asked to speak first. He wanted his voice steady before the truth landed in the room. When the envelope was opened, the answer was clear. Ava was his biological daughter. A quiet murmur rippled across the gallery. Maxwell kept his eyes on her, seeing the faint confusion on her face, as though the world had just shifted beneath her feet. He thought about the day she knocked on his door, asking for bread, the night she whispered, "Daddy, don't leave," and felt something resolute take hold inside him. This wasn't just coincidence. It was responsibility, undeniable and permanent. The proceedings grew complicated quickly. A woman rose from the back of the courtroom, Nora Alvarez Rosa's younger sister. Her clothes were worn, her posture guarded. She introduced herself as Ava's aunt. "I love my niece," Nora said, her voice trembling, "and I want her with family. But I don't have stable housing yet. I've been moving from couch to couch. I can't provide what she needs right now." The room grew still. Nora's admission wasn't a challenge, it was heartbreak. She wanted Ava, but she knew she couldn't keep her safe alone. The judge acknowledged Nora's presence, then turned to Maxwell. "Mr. Reid, you've been given temporary guardianship. Are you prepared to assume full custody with all the obligations it entails?" The weight of the question settled in. Cameras outside, board members whispering in corporate halls, investors preparing to turn their backs. None of it mattered as much as the way Ava's small eyes followed him. He rose and spoke, his voice steady. "Yes, Your Honor. I'm prepared to be her father. Whatever it takes." Minnie Hook. Within hours, the world outside demanded to test those words. On the courthouse steps, microphones thrust toward him. Maxwell did something no one expected. He admitted his company had failed families like Rosa's. He announced the relief and remission program, publicly pledging his own bonus to seed a fund for struggling small businesses. No child should pay the price for a parent's loan, he said. The reaction was swift. Headlines lit up. Critics called it an admission of guilt. The board at Reid Capital convened an emergency session. By nightfall, he was informed that they were preparing a vote to strip him of executive authority. Maxwell had lost battles before, but never one that felt this personal. Still, when he looked at Ava asleep in the townhouse guest room, bread roll clutched to her chest, he knew he had made the only choice he could live with. Days later, he took her to Central Park. Winter clung to the branches, but sunlight streamed through patches of pale sky. Ava's shoulders stiffened when a siren blared from the street nearby. She froze, hands clenched, eyes wide. Maxwell knelt immediately, guiding her through the grounding exercise Camilla had taught him. 5 things you can see, he whispered. 4 things you can touch. His own heart pounded, but he kept his voice steady until her breathing slowed her grip, loosening around his sleeve. Strangers glanced their way, but he didn't care. That moment wasn't about appearances. It was about keeping a promise he wouldn't leave her to face fear alone. Minnie Hook. The Brooklyn Bridge carried his next test. Maxwell arranged to meet Nora there, knowing she deserved more than a court form to explain his intentions. The winter wind cut across the span, carrying the smell of the river below. Nora stood with her hands shoved deep into her pockets, eyes weary. "You took my sister's place," she said bluntly. "You held the power that pushed her down, and now you want to raise Ava up. How am I supposed to trust that Maxwell didn't argue?" He told her the truth, the bodega file, the denied claim, the foreclosure he had signed. He admitted he had never once thought about the human cost behind those papers until Ava appeared at his door. "I can't undo what I did," he said quietly, "but I can make sure she never suffers for my mistakes again. And if you want to be part of her life, I'll help you find stability housing work, whatever it takes. This doesn't have to be me against you. It can be both of us if you're ready." Nora's face softened, though tears welled in her eyes. She wasn't ready to give Ava up completely, but she also knew she couldn't carry the responsibility alone. Slowly, she nodded. "For her sake, maybe we can figure it out together." That evening, as they walked back across the bridge, Ava clung to Maxwell's arm. The skyline glowed against the dusk, the city alive beneath them. She looked up and whispered, "Promise you won't shut the door." Maxwell bent to her level, his voice steady, every word deliberate. "Never. I'll stay, always." The board vote came the next day. As predicted, they stripped Maxwell of his role as CEO. But instead of silence, he stood before the press and announced he would chair the new foundation created from the Community Bread Fund. His days of chasing profit were over. His mission now was to turn the wealth he once hoarded into safety for those who had none. Later that night, back at the townhouse, Ava padded into his study holding 2 rolls wrapped in a napkin. "One for you," she said softly, placing one in his hand and one for me. "So we don't forget." He felt his throat tighten. Bread had been her survival, her ritual of rationing. Now she was offering it as a sign of belonging, a bond between them. For the first time in decades, Maxwell felt the ground beneath his feet was steady, not because of wealth or power, but because of a promise kept. He had lost the title that once defined him, but he had gained something more enduring, a daughter's trust. And in that trust lay the test of staying, a test he intended never to fail. The grand opening of the bread room drew neighbors from every corner of Washington Heights. What had once been Rosa's shuttered bodega was now alive with the smell of fresh loaves and the hum of voices rising above the clatter of trays. The new sign above the door read simply, "Bread that stays warm." Inside, sunlight fell across wide counters lined with baskets of sourdough, rye, and rolls, wrapped in brown paper stamped with a small open-door emblem. It was more than a bakery. It was a community hub, a training space, a place where people could work, learn, and leave with dignity. Ava stood proudly behind the counter, a small apron tied awkwardly around her waist. Her hair was neatly brushed, though strands still curled stubbornly at her temples. She took coins from a neighbor's hand, counted the change with deliberate care, then slipped the money into a tin box. She wasn't rationing anymore. She was keeping tally like a cashier. Her counting, finally a sign of contribution, not desperation. When she caught Maxwell watching her, she grinned, a spark of pride in her blue eyes. He had never seen her glow like that before. Nora was there too, managing the front display with surprising confidence. With Maxwell's support, she had secured an apartment nearby, a steady role at the bakery, and training that would one day allow her to run a branch of her own. For now, she greeted customers warmly, her voice steady, even when emotion flickered at the edges. "Try Lena's loaf," she told one customer, pointing to a simple round bread named in honor of her sister. It was the first recipe they had perfected together, and every sale felt like a tribute to the woman they had both lost. Maxwell moved quietly through the room, shaking hands, answering questions about the fund that supported the bakery. Some of the board members who had voted him out showed up without fanfare, curious, perhaps guilty. He didn't dwell on their motives. What mattered was that people left with bread they could afford, and a sense that someone cared enough to open the door for them. In a quiet corner, the memory box he and Ava had started sat on a shelf, already filling with small artifacts. The bakery receipt, the Metro card, the first business license for the bread room, even a bread wrapper signed by the first customer. Ava added something new that morning, a Polaroid of her Maxwell and Nora standing outside the shop with the fresh sign above them. She tucked it inside carefully, then closed the lid with a satisfied nod. The days that followed settled into a rhythm. Maxwell spent mornings at the bakery, afternoons at the foundation office, and evenings at home with Ava. The townhouse no longer felt sterile. Toys collected in the living room, children's books spilled across the sofa, laughter echoed down hallways once silent. At night, he still checked on her before sleeping, but now she met his gaze with a soft, "Good night, Dad," the word certain, not tentative. It was no longer a plea, it was a bond. One Saturday, he took her to the High Line. The elevated park stretched above the city's spring flowers blooming along the pathway. They carried small paper bags, each filled with rolls baked that morning. As they walked, they offered them to anyone who looked like they needed a little warmth. An elderly man sitting on a bench, a mother with 2 children huddled near the railing. Ava's voice was clear and confident as she handed out each bag. "If you're hungry, knock," she said, repeating the phrase printed on the logo. Maxwell watched her, his chest heavy with pride. She had transformed the word that once marked her desperation into a message of hope for others. When they paused beneath the fading light of sunset, Ava leaned against his side. "Do you think Mom would like it?" she asked softly. Maxwell placed a hand on her shoulder. "I think she would be proud. Of you. Of all of this." She nodded, her gaze fixed on the skyline where the sun dipped behind towers of glass. The work didn't stop at one shop. With the foundation's resources, they began laying plans to open similar bread rooms in Detroit and New Orleans, cities where food insecurity had long haunted families. Maxwell traveled with Ava to meet community leaders, ensuring she saw that their mission was bigger than either of them. At each site, Ava left behind a small drawing of a door taped near the counter, a reminder that the movement began with a single knock. On the anniversary of the bakery's opening, the bread room overflowed with people. Neighbors, volunteers, donors, and families crowded inside. Maxwell stood at the front not to claim credit, but to thank those who had carried the vision forward. Ava stood beside him, clutching his hand, and when the applause filled the room, she whispered something only he could hear. We kept the door open. He bent down and kissed her hair, whispering back, "Always." As the evening ended, they walked home through streets alive with music and voices. Ava carried a single roll in her pocket, a quiet ritual she hadn't given up, though now it was less about survival and more about remembrance. Maxwell carried one too. Together they knew it wasn't just bread they had kept warm, it was trust, dignity, and the belief that no one should ever face a closed door when they are hungry or alone. And now the question turns to you. Tonight, within 5 miles of where you live, someone will go to bed hungry. Someone will knock on a door hoping it opens. Will it be yours? Take action. Support your local food pantry. Share this story with a friend or comment "I'll open the door with your city." Every pledge becomes a promise. Every act keeps the bread warm. And sometimes that small decision to stay, to open, to give changes everything. Maxwell Reid's life was once defined by balance sheets, market forecasts, and the cold certainty of contracts. He measured success by numbers and power, never by connection. But all of that changed the moment Ava knocked on his door with bare feet and a trembling voice that called him Dad. That single moment unraveled the life he thought he had built, forcing him to face truths that money and influence could never shield him from. What began as a shocking encounter became a journey that tested not just Maxwell's resources but his humanity. The hospital nights, the courtroom hearings, the boardroom confrontations, all of it stripped away the image of an untouchable billionaire and revealed a man confronted by his own failures. The foreclosure he had once signed without a second thought had devastated Rosa and Ava's life. Yet in that devastation came his chance for redemption. Ava, in her innocence and quiet strength, transformed everything. She taught Maxwell that survival could give way to generosity, that trust could be rebuilt piece by piece, and that love was not an abstract concept but a daily choice to stay. Where she once rationed crumbs to survive, she now handed out loaves to others, showing that healing does not erase the past, but instead reshapes it into something life-giving. The bread room born in memory of Rosa and sustained by Maxwell and Ava's bond became the visible proof of this transformation. It was no longer about wealth or reputation, it was about presence. About ensuring no child in their neighborhood would ever have to knock on doors in desperation and be turned away. For the community, it was hope. For Ava, it was home. For Maxwell, it was the first chapter of a life measured not by what he accumulated, but by what he gave. The lesson here is one that cuts across generations and circumstances. It reminds us that the power to change a life often starts with a simple act: opening a door, sharing a meal, listening when it's easier to turn away. We live in a world where indifference has become second nature, where walking past suffering can feel normal. But Maxwell's journey shows that indifference is far costlier than compassion. And so, the question becomes personal for each of us who is knocking at your door. Maybe not with bare feet on a winter night, but through a neighbor's need, a friend's silence, or a stranger's plea. Are we willing to notice, to pause, to stay? Bread in this story is not just food, it is a symbol of what we can all offer: warmth, dignity, and hope. Take this story as an invitation. Find one way this week to open your own door, whether that means volunteering at a local shelter, offering support to a struggling family, or simply choosing to see the humanity in those around you. You don't need billions to change a life, you just need to stay. If Ava's resilience and Maxwell's transformation moved you, then help us continue sharing stories like this. Subscribe to this channel, leave a comment, and share this video with someone who needs encouragement today. Your support fuels our mission to create content that inspires and uplifts. Hit that subscribe button now and join us in keeping the bread and the hope warm for everyone.